Welcome back. This week on Timber Valley Woodworking, we're going to be making a record box using dovetail joinery. I also laminated a walnut face to the front to give it a little bit of a different look. I started by gluing up some panels and planing them to thickness. Then I took them over to the table saw to cut their width. This will end up being the height of the box. After deciding on the final dimensions, I put my crosscut sled on the table saw to square up the first side. If you'd like a little more information about this sled, there is another video on my channel showing the making of it. After squaring up the first side, I can then set the measurement on my stop block and cut the length of my pieces. Once I have all my pieces cut to size, I can then start laying out my dovetails. First, I'll set my marking gauge using the thickness of one side, and then mark it on the other side. I like to give it one light pass and then one heavy pass to set the mark. Then I'll take my piece over to the vise and clamp it securely in place. I personally like to start with my tails, so I'm going to mark those out with a pencil and then mark the pieces I'm going to remove with an X, followed by scoring along those lines with a marking knife. Now, I accidentally forgot to hit record when I was cutting out these tails, so I've prepared a reenactment. I don't usually use a jig for dovetails, I just cut them by eye. I start by making an angled cut on one side that looks suitable and match it up on the other side. How's that for dramatic slow-mo? Now that we know how we got here, let's move on. After clamping my piece to the bench, I can then start removing the waste with a chisel. I begin by tapping the chisel in close to the line, and then coming in at an angle to remove about 1/8 of an inch at a time. You'll want to do this till you're about halfway through, and then flip it over and take care of the other side. Once you've removed the bulk, you can put your chisel right into the line and clean it up tight. Once the tails are complete, I then move on to marking out the pins. A hand planer works great as a spacer. You want to place the piece that you're going to mark the pins on into the vise and place the tails on top level with the outside. You can then use a marking knife to score a line, and don't forget to mark out your waist. It would be a shame if you cut out the wrong pieces. Don't ask me how I know. I'll then take my Japanese pull saw and cut along the lines, making sure to stay on the waist side of the mark. First cutting one side of each pin and then flipping the board around to cut the other side, trying my very best not to go past my mark. Repeating the process for the other board, I head over to the table and clamp my piece and chisel out my waist. And in a rush to record, I made a pretty big mistake here you're going to catch in a second. Once again, I like to start about 1/16 of an inch away from my mark and then clean it up on the final pass. And here's where I realized my mistake. Just watch. Oh! Don't chisel out the ends. But now I get the opportunity to show you how to repair it and do it properly. And you guessed it, I'm going to glue it back on. A little Type-on 3 makes short work of this problem. After about an hour of clamping pressure, you should be good to continue. Now what I should have done earlier is cut it out with the saw while I was cutting out the tails, and only use the chisel to clean up to the line like so. Sometimes you get a little forgetful when you're focusing on the filming. Ah, look at that clamp. Now we're going to repeat that process on the other side. If you're having trouble cutting a straight line, you can take your square and mark it to give you a visual aid. Hey look, I remembered this time. After cleaning up the edges, I'm going to be looking for a nice snug joint. I'm not too concerned about a few tiny gaps, as I'll be taking care of those later. Next, you're going to want to sand the insides of those panels at the very least, because it's going to be a lot harder to sand once you get it all glued up. Now we're going to do a little bit of house cleaning, because this place is a pigsty. Then I'm going to cut out my bottom panel. I had a few offcuts of some 1/4-inch marine ply, so that's what I used. After cutting my width, I squared up one side with the crosscut sled, then flipped it over and cut the other side. After giving it a quick sand, because that's another piece that'll be hard to do later, I can then work on cutting the dado slot into the panels. Now my panels are just under 1/2 inch thick, so I'm going to set the depth of those dados about 3/16 of an inch, and I'm going to set my fence to make the first cut about 1/4 inch up from the bottom. My table saw blade is 1/8 of an inch thick, so I move my fence 1/8 of an inch, and that'll give me my 1/4 inch slot that I need. Now it's time for a dry fit. Let's see how I did. Looks like it's ready to move on to glue up. I'm going to be gluing up with Titebond 3. You could really use any PVA glue though. One of the bonuses for TB3 is its longer working time. I like using a silicone basting brush to get the glue inside the dovetails. And when you're done with it, you can just set it aside, because after the glue dries, it'll just peel right off. Once everything is glued up and assembled, it's time for clamping. For something of this size, I like to get a clamp on each corner going each direction, usually taking about 8. And even though there's a bottom panel to keep things square, I still like to use corner clamps just in case. After a couple of hours, you should be good to remove all those clamps. For this project, I decided to get a little wacky and laminate a walnut face. So I prepped the surface for glue up and measured its final dimensions. I then headed over to the crosscut sled to cut my final length. To get a good lamination, don't be shy on the glue and spread it around evenly. And don't be afraid to use a couple extra clamps. Each corner and the center as much as you can get on it. And try not to over tighten any of the clamps. The more even the pressure, the better. After a couple of hours, it's time to remove the clamps. I then head over to the router, and after blowing off a pound of dust, I switch the round over for a flush trim bit. This will allow me to clean up the edges quickly and efficiently. Earlier, when I cut the dado for the bottom panel, I left a visible hole in the maple. Now's the time to fill that up and flush cut it before sanding. And to fill up any gaps in the dovetails, I just spread some glue over them and sand it without dust collection. The dust will mix with the glue and fill up any of those small gaps, just like magic. Poof! That is one pretty joint. I've decided to install handles in this box, so I'm making a jig that's going to make it a little bit easier. I mark out where I'm going to drill out 2 holes with an 1.5" Forstner bit, and once they're cut out, I can play connect the dots and mark up where I'm going to cut out with a jigsaw. A little bit of cleanup and it's ready to go. I mark center and hold the jig while I draw out the handle. Oh, too big. This will give me a reference while I drill holes that I can use to cut it out with a jigsaw. Then I clamp the jig back in place and set up my router with a flush trim bit. It's a much nicer method than trying to cut it out by hand, and bonus, it's repeatable. After cutting out the handle on the other side, it's time to sand the whole box up to 320. After a quick cleaning, I set up my laptop for the laser show. My preferred program for engraving is Lightburn. A quick Google search will tell you anything you need to know about it. After sizing up my logo and putting on my safety gear, I can then line up my laser for the burn. My little laser takes about 20 minutes to do a burn like this. Isn't technology so cool? Next, we move on to finishing, and you guessed it, Odie super duper. Wipe on 2 coats and clean it off real good. It's one of the easiest finishes to apply. And there you have it, a Dovetail Record Box. And if you like this video, like, share, comment, and give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to watch some more of my videos, links should be popping up right now.